Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the second infection of the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, where we are reading this. We are reading Hilary Mantel's Booker Prize-winning novel, Wolf Hall, in the month of March. I meant to do a video on this yesterday, but I had a guest. I've had a guest for a few days, and then when the guest leaves, you know, everything feels sad, or sadder, and everything feels a little lonely, and there's also tons and tons of cleaning up to do, rearranging things and whatnot. Also, I had a certain little type A personality to reassure that the world was not ending, etc., etc. But we're reading today part 1 and part 2 of Wolf Hall, which is the story of Thomas Cromwell, a famous would become a famous statesman, advisor to King Henry VIII. A famous portrait by Hans Holbein that you may have seen. You may have seen it. You may not have seen it. It's quite. I'm sure you can call it up on Google. It's quite amazing. This book has, of course, since then become famous. It won the Booker Prize. It was adapted for stage. It was adapted for screen, both small and large. It's a huge, huge success. And as I mentioned in my preparatory video for Wolf Hall, one of the only things that you need to know here, I've had so many people emailing me about this, saying, you know, just like with A Distant Mirror, our first infection in the STD book club, people emailing me saying, well, should I read Dermot McCullough's biography of Cromwell before I read this book? Dermot McCullough's biography of Cromwell is 1,000 pages long. If you had to read 1,000 pages in order to prepare yourself for even understanding this book would not be in the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. You don't need to prepare at all to be pulled into the story. But one bit of preparation that I did give you was to sort of fill you in, those who are not familiar with the time period, with how exactly a man would rise. We know from this book, that's right, the bean is yawning compulsively behind me. We know from this book that this is going to be the rise of Thomas Cromwell. So I sketched in how a man would rise, a man who is nobody. Cromwell is born in Putney, son of a local strongman, destined for death in a gutter somewhere, or in a foreign war. He has no prospects, he has no money, he has no foothold in court, with a capital C, which is the way that you advance. If you don't advance in the clergy, you advance at court. And the way that you do that is to attach yourself to a household of someone greater than yourself, greater than your family. It's usually a stroke of luck. It's highly sought after. Does your ordinary working class father have any connection with a guildsman, a great grocer, maybe a prosperous lawyer, so that you can go and apprentice as a boy in his kitchen or in his livery stable? And maybe if you're quick-witted and he likes the cut of your jib, you can rise in that household. And maybe once you've risen in that household, you can then move on to a greater household, to a greater establishment. That's how it's done. And by a miracle of fate, that's how it's done with Cromwell, too, in this book. He is, as the opening pages of the parts that we're reading today show us, he is the miserable, beaten, and kicked son of a loutish father who has no intention of ever making anything better for his son. Only worse. A nightmare. And he leaves as soon as he can. He goes abroad. He goes to Italy and elsewhere to become a hired sword, but he wants to do more than that. He has a native quickness of intelligence, a native depth of spirit, and eventually he does attach himself to a counting house and learns the trade of a counting house. This is after, thanks to the fact that he's been an apprentice soldier, he's learned lots of other trades too. He becomes a harsh, ruthless, clear-sighted, forward-looking man in this book. I want to stress that because one or two of the emails that I've gotten about this book have tended towards the very thing that I have said has no place in the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, and that is pedantry. And nothing brings out the pedants more than the Tudor era. I have no idea why. I have no idea why, but nothing brings them out of the woodwork more than this era in history. I want to issue just a gentle warning once again that is not welcome here, and I will not tolerate it. Okay, so don't do it. But the point that I'm trying to make here, the point that I'm trying to stress, is that the Cromwell that Hilary Mantel invents for this book is her invention. This is historical fiction. what we can gather, the most natural inferences between the lines of the historical Thomas Cromwell is probably quite different from the Cromwell in these pages. But it doesn't matter anyway, because we get such an intensely interior narration of this man and his world that, I mean, we never see the world through anyone's eyes except Cromwell. He talks with everyone. We learn a lot. He extrapolates on what other people think. But we're seeing this world from the inside out, from him. It's not even a limited third-person narration. It's where we're just following him around from place to place. Now, we're inside his mind. We're inside his heart. And when we meet him, as this book begins, with a few flashbacks to Putney and whatnot in 1500, we meet him in the 1520s, when he is already a rising man. He has already spoken in Parliament. He is a lawyer. What are you doing? Oh, my goodness. Oh, goodness gracious. Let me get that out of your way there. You going to make yourself comfortable? Huh? Oh. She's doing yoga off camera. Sorry. I know her yoga is very popular, but she's doing yoga off camera. Watching her very closely because of the disruption here with the David Murphy Memorial Cot and its placement in the room, she was tempted to go on one of her hunger strikes. Those can last for a week at a time. I didn't want that to happen, so I've been hovering over her whenever I put food out. And also, she has a little bit of a cut on one of her feet. I'm watching that as well. So, but anyway, where were we? Dog talk. We don't want to start on dog. Oh, right. In these first two parts, because Mantell is giving us such an interior narration, in these two parts, I think she makes the wise decision of really giving us Cromwell, the heart and soul, rather than the politics and maneuvering. There's some of that, but not a lot. In the two parts that we're reading today, there are a lot of deeply personal moments in these sections, because Cromwell has succeeded. He is back in England, and he has succeeded in attaching himself to a household and rising in that household until he is absolutely indispensable to it, which is amazing. Considering his beginnings, it's amazing. And the household is Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chancellor, and also the Archbishop of York, Archbishop of Canterbury, a major figure. Wolsey was an advisor to Henry VIII's father and was heavily instrumental in shaping Henry VIII's political and social views. His acknowledgement, his understanding of and skill at what we call realpolitik. Wolsey was intensely influential at doing all of that. He is the king's other half, a major advisor to Henry VIII, the greatest power in the land other than the king. And Cromwell is his right-hand man. Once we move forward to the 1520s, Cromwell is his right-hand man. And Mantell makes it pretty obvious that there is a very strong father-son bond there. It's strengthened by the fact that Wolsey also came from nothing. Butcher's boy, so as his enemies said. He rose from almost nothing in Ipswich, much as Cromwell did in Putney. There's that element there. There's none of the instinctive condescension towards Cromwell that we see on other people in this narrative. A strong character all throughout the three books of the Wolf Hall trilogy is the Duke of Norfolk, who irritatedly asked at one point in the parts that we're reading today, he irritatedly asked Cromwell, why are you such a person? In other words, why are you self-respecting, introspective, three-dimensional? You shouldn't be. It's above your station to be that. You should be more like a barnyard animal. Wolsey doesn't have anything like that, and has a kind of teasing, sardonic relationship with Cromwell. But they both come from hard, checkered pasts. And there's one scene here that does a beautiful job describing that, just beautiful. They're talking in Wolsey's chamber at night. There's fire from the candles, there's fire from the fireplace. Of course, there are no electric lamps. So if you haven't spent any or much time in rooms like that, you won't remember when you have irregular light from candles or a fireplace. Shadows are a very active part of the room. They move all around. I wanted to get you that first because he and Cromwell are talking, and Cromwell says that there is gossip among the silk merchants' wives in the city. Wolsey wants to know what it is. He says, "You cannot speak and not speak. You must tell me now." And Cromwell says, "It's only what the women are saying. the silk women, and the cloth merchants' wives. He waits, smiling. Our narrative about Cromwell is said in the third person. He is Cromwell. We'll get to that. Believe you me, we'll get to that. He waits, smiling, which is of no interest to you, I'm sure. Laughing, the cardinal pushes back his chair, and his shadow rises with him. Firelit, it leaps. His arm darts out. His reach is long. His hand is like the hand of God. But when God closes his hand, the subject of his room, his subject is across the room, back to the wall. Wolsey gets up and makes a gesture with his hand, and Cromwell is across the room. The cardinal gives ground. His shadow wavers. It wavers and comes to rest. He is still. The wall records the movement of his hand. His head inclines. In a halo of light, he seems to pause, to examine his handful of nothing. He splays his fingers, his giant firelit hand. He places it flat on his desk. It vanishes, melted into the cloth of damask. He sits down again. His head is bowed, his face half dark. It's an incredibly delicate moment. He has been misunderstood. He doesn't know what to do. He, Thomas, also Tomas, also Tommaso, also Thomas Cremule, withdraws his past selves into his present body and edges back to where he was before. His single shadow slides against the wall, a visitor not sure of his welcome. Which of these Thomases saw the blow coming? There are moments when a memory moves right through you. You shy, you duck, you run, or else the past takes your fist and actuates it without the intervention of will. Suppose you have a knife in your fist. That's how murder happens. He says something, the cardinal says something, they break off, 2 sentences go nowhere. This is remarkably delicate writing. This is an impossible scene to describe, and she's doing it. The cardinal resumes his chair. He hesitates before him. He sits down. The cardinal says, I really would like the London gossip, but I wasn't planning to beat it out of you. The cardinal bows his head, frowns at a paper on his desk. He is allowing time for the difficult moment to pass, and when he speaks again, his tone is measured and easy, like a man telling anecdotes after supper. When I was a child, my father had a friend, customer, really, who was of florid complexion. And this Scarlet Revel was his name, Miles Revel. His hand drifts to rest again, palm downwards on the blackish damask. For some reason, I used to believe, though I dare say he was an honest citizen and liked a glass of Rhenish, I used to believe he was a drinker of blood. I don't know, some story, I suppose, that I heard from my nurse or from some other silly child. And then when my father's apprentices knew about it, only because I was foolish enough to whine and cry, they would shout out, Here comes Revel for his cup of blood, Thomas Wolsey. I used to flee as if the devil were after me, put a marketplace between us. I marvel that I didn't fall under a wagon. I used to run and never look. Even today, he says. He picks up a waxed seal from the desk, turns it over, puts it down. Even today, when I see a fair, florid man, let's say the Duke of Suffolk, I feel inclined to burst into tears. He pauses. His gaze comes to rest. You have to supply that his gaze comes to rest on Cromwell. She doesn't write that. His gaze comes to rest. So, Thomas, can't a cleric stand up unless you think he's after your blood? He picks up the seal again, turns it over in his fingers. He averts his eyes. He begins to play with words. Would a bishop abash you? A parish clerk panic you? A deacon disconcert? He says, What is the word? I don't know in English. An extoc. Perhaps there is no English word for it. The black-bladed knife that, at close quarters, you push up under the ribs. The cardinal says, and this was... They're trying to explain to each other, but it's incredibly awkward. Wolsey knows what made Cromwell leap out of that chair. He felt it himself as a boy. They know each other in this moment. They have a moment of naked knowing of each other. This was some 20 years ago. A lesson is learned and learned well. Night, ice, the still heart of Europe, a forest, lakes silver beneath a pattern of winter stars, a room, firelight, a shape slipping against the wall. He didn't see his assassin, but he saw his shadow move. All the same, says the cardinal, it's 40 years since I saw Master Revel. He will be long dead. I suppose. And your man, he says, he hesitates, long dead too? It is the most delicate way that can be contrived to ask a man if he has killed someone. And then the moment is over. Just like that. And Wolsey and Cromwell suddenly know each other much, much better on ways that conversation cannot do. And part of the knowing, part of their increasingly in-depth relationship is that Wolsey is starting to think about Cromwell's limitations, or lack thereof. He's trying to think of Cromwell's future and wonders if there will come a day when Cromwell will be advising the king. Cromwell himself, at this point in the book, thinks that's unthinkable. He acknowledges that there's no chance that anyone will ever have a relationship with the king like Wolsey does. He actually says it, right? The idea that he or anyone else might come to have Wolsey's hold over the king is about as likely as Anne Cromwell becoming Lord Mayor. We know that it's going to be true. And Wolsey is starting to sense it, and he asks Cromwell, I wonder, would you have the patience with our sovereign lord? When it is midnight and he is up drinking and giggling with Brandon or singing and the day's paper's not yet signed, when you press him, he says, I'm for bed now. We're hunting tomorrow. If your chances come to serve, you will have to take him as he is, a pleasure-loving prince. And he will have to take you as you are, which is rather like one of those square-shaped fighting dogs that low men tow about on ropes. Not that you are without a fitful charm, Tom. He goes home, this is Cromwell, he goes home to tell Liz, that's his wife, about the fighting dogs. She also thinks it's strikingly apt. He doesn't tell her about the fitful charm, in case it's something only the cardinal can see. Liz is his wife. And another element in this chapter is the intense humanization of Cromwell. Because he loses his wife to the sweating sickness. And then he loses his girl. He loses the child of their love, their little Grace. And it's unbelievably well done. I mean, the scene where he loses Liz is unbelievably well done. He's at work when she dies. She sends word, as soon as she knows that it's serious, she sends word to find him, sends people all over London. But there were no cell phones, no telephones. They had to look everywhere, and they just didn't find him in time. By the time he gets home, she's dead. Which is not true for his little girl. I wanted to read that too. Grace dies in his arms. She dies easily, as naturally as she was born. He eases her back against the damp sheet, a child of impossible perfection, her fingers uncurling like thin white leaves. I never knew her, he thinks. I never knew I had her. It was always seemed impossible to him that some act of his gave her life, some unthinking thing that he and Liz did on some unmemorable night. They had intended the name to be Henry for a boy, Catherine for a girl, and Liz had said, that will do honor to your cat as well, Cromwell's previous wife. But when he had seen her, swaddled, beautiful, finished and perfect, he had said quite another thing, and Liz had agreed. We cannot earn grace. We do not merit it. He asked the priest if his elder daughter can be buried with her copybook in which she had written her name, Anne Cromwell. The priest says he's never heard of such a thing. He's too tired and angry to fight. His daughters are now in purgatory, a country of slow fires and ridged ice. Where in the Gospels does it say purgatory? Tyndall, this is the man who's trying to get the Bible printed in English and is being hunted by the agents of Thomas More to kill him for that horrible indecency. Tyndall says, now abideth faith and hope and love, even these three, but the greatest of these is love. Thomas More thinks it is a wicked mistranslation. He insists on charity. He would chain you up for a mistranslation. He would, for a difference in your Greek, kill you. He, this is Cromwell, wonders again if the dead need translators. Perhaps in a moment, in a simple twist of unbecoming, they know everything they need to know. That is pretty amazing. That is pretty amazing. And one of the things, in addition to intensely humanizing Cromwell, another thing that does is give you a hint of a drastic difference in this piece of historical fiction as opposed to most historical fiction set in the Tudor era, which is the portrayal of Thomas More. It's absolutely crucial in this book. The two Thomases, the Thomases are all over the place. As KD Books mentioned about Wolf Hall, there are Thomases everywhere. Thomas is a Wolsey, Thomas is a Cromwell, also Thomas More. And the two Thomases that are most important in this book are Wolsey and Cromwell, or Wolsey and More. Although there's another Cromwell, there's another Thomas. The Duke of Norfolk is also a Thomas. Those two are the most important. And the portrait of More here, whew, he is a loathsome, horrible, hypocritical monster. Someone who's perfectly willing to spout pieties in the face of the king and also use his own hands and winches to torture people over, as it's put here, a mistranslation. So those are the first two parts that we get here. Cromwell is on the rise, and Wolsey's fall is crucial to all of this. He has risen very high. Many of the entitled noblemen who have family pedigrees going back to the Trump of Doom don't like that. They don't like how imperious Wolsey has become. In this, Hilary Mantel very much takes from Shakespeare's Henry VIII. They want his downfall. They just can't act against him openly. He is by proxy to the king. So there's no way that they can do that. But when the king's sentiments towards Cromwell or towards Wolsey change, they're ready to pounce. They are ready. And that brings about Wolsey's downfall. I mean, other events do as well. Wolsey has signally failed at the most important task set in front of him, which is to get Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled so that he can marry Anne Boleyn and get a male heir. Wolsey, that sort of falls within his purview, and he can't do it. He ultimately fails at it. And that and a few other things ultimately turn the king against him. Anne Boleyn is one of those other things. She's working hard to turn the king against Wolsey. And when he falls, those noblemen and their hangers-on, those men who have always had their knives out for Wolsey, rejoice in his downfall. They come to arrest him. And make, therefore, this is another literary license on Hilary Mantel's part, they make, therefore, a lifelong enemy of Thomas Cromwell. Mantel looks at all the various records and sees a through line where one does not necessarily exist. Any of you who really love historical fiction will remember that Robert Graves does that exact same thing with Livia in I, Claudius. He sees a through line and he assigns a motive and an inexorable decade-long campaign. It makes for very, very good reading. Whether there's enough historical evidence to believe it, it makes for very, very good reading. And that, speaking of the reading, before I finish up for today, I wanted to address the elephant in the room when it comes to this book, which is the odd rhetorical way that Mantel has decided, very consciously, to tell the story, which is the he business. This is the he business, is what people think of it as. And it can be disconcerting at first, because she refers to Cromwell often as he. But that doesn't jive well with the fact that it's an intensely interior third-person point of view. Those two don't really go together. So when she says he, if you are accustomed to third-person point of view narration, you're automatically thinking that the he that is being referred to is the last male character to speak. We saw it in that scene where the he is not Wolsey. The he is Cromwell. That happens all throughout all three books. I myself think, I have always thought that this series should be called He Cromwell, as opposed to the Wolf Hall trilogy or whatever. I think it even has some other name, but you do get used to it. Trust me, you do get used to it. And Mantel knows very well what she's doing. Her mastery in writing these novels is evident. She knows what she's doing. And she also knows the level of confusion that can arise from it, which is why throughout the books, when she thinks she needs to, specifies and says he, Cromwell. Now, you might be reading that and become a little impatient as a reader and say, well, if you have to clarify your own rhetorical choice, then why make it? If you have to go out of your way to do that, then shouldn't that be an indication to you that it's a bad rhetorical choice? I hear that, as the 21st century says. I hear that. And here's how I want to respond. My response is going to seem a little harsh, but here's how I want to respond. If you're reading through Wolf Hall and you're stumbling over he, Cromwell, And you're starting impatiently to think, well, if you can see that it doesn't work, then why did you do it? With a book this great, my response would be, if you can write a better book, then you can take her to task for artistic decisions. Writing on this level is beyond most people. I'm willing to, in light of that fact, in acknowledgement of that fact, I'm willing to allow for quirks. I don't know. I mean, speaking for myself, I'm right on the same page with the rest of you. Speaking for myself, I sometimes think that he, Cromwell, jolts the narrative to a halt and takes you completely out of it. Takes you out of 1527 England and puts you in Hilary Mantel's writing room where she's making that conscious decision. But I also think it could be defended rhetorically. But anyway, in case you were wondering, if you're reading this for the first time, that is certainly the thing you noticed, is he, Cromwell. We are inside his mind and heart, but we are taken out of him to refer to him in the third person like that. You just have to get used to it, and you will. You will get used to it. I'd be surprised if you aren't used to it already. We're going to read the next two, I think the next two parts here. Is that right? Here, let's go to the table of contents. Yeah, we're going to read part 3 and part 4. So all the way up to page 415 in this Canadian trade paperback. We're going to read part 3 and part 4 for next week. And then we'll do... did I already go through this? I'm such a bad book club person. Yeah, we're going to read part 3 and part 4 for next week. And the week after that, we'll read part 5 and part 6. And then for the final week in March, I will do a Zoom chat with Thomas Cromwell. Should be lots of fun. I'll find somebody to talk to. If only it could be Hilary Mantel. That would be so nice. But if I don't do that, then we'll have some sort of a rollicking general discussion. But I'm really eager to know. Those of you who've never read this before, Wolf Hall has been sort of the unpaid debt of book readers forever. It was published to universal acclaim when it came out. Universal. As I've said many times on this channel, if you can find a historical novel that has its praises sung by both me and Christopher Hitchens, then you have found a historical novel that lives up to its hype. And as a result, there were copies everywhere. It's always in used bookstores. Everybody has a copy sitting there on their shelf just staring at them. And I was kind of hoping that this new infection of the STD book club would free those copies from their shelves and actually get people to take it down and actually read it. And if you're one of those people, I would love to know what you're making of what you've done so far. I would be willing to bet it's not like any historical fiction that you've ever read. In fact, in the 2 parts that we read for today, we get direct call-outs to this period in one of the most popular books written about this subject matter before this book, which was The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory, which is about Anne Boleyn's sister, who infatuates the king and becomes pregnant with him, with a child by him, and doesn't demand anything. She doesn't hold out like Anne Boleyn does. She doesn't wait to be given lands and titles and then the crown. And she's the subject of The Other Boleyn Girl, or in the UK, The Other Boleyn Sister. And she's in these chapters. Of course, everybody is in these chapters except for 2 crucial characters who are barely mentioned at all in all 3 books because Mantel made the rhetorical decision, the writerly decision, that their presence would derail the story. Couldn't help but derail the story. We'll get to that when we're at the end of the book. But Mary Boleyn is in here. And there are some turns of phrase in her parts of these parts of the book. There are some turns of phrase that are clearly meant to look straight at The Other Boleyn Sister. But that was, narratively speaking, a far less adventurous book and had nowhere near the level of writing beauty, nowhere near it. So knowing that we have all that packed away, we're going to move on to the next 2 parts for next week, which this meeting was derailed by my guest, but next week unless I have another guest, we will be right on time on the weekend. So I will wrap this up for now, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.